Hello, I'm Alina Polyakova, President and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis. Welcome to CEPA's conversations on the state of the transatlantic alliance, reflecting on the now more than year since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. And I'm absolutely delighted to be having this conversation today with Germany's ambassador to the United States, Ambassador Emily Haber, who has a storied reputation here in Washington. But of course, Germany has been an anchor and a key ally in the transatlantic response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So Ambassador, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you for inviting me, Alina.
It's great to have you. Well, let me start with the big question. You know, we are now over a year into this brutal war in Ukraine. We're over a year into Chancellor Scholz's now very famous speech declaring the Zeitenwende, the watershed moment for Germany, for Europe, 3 days after Russia's invasion. You know, looking back, reflecting on where we started and where we are today, how do you assess allies' support for Ukraine today? Where are we now?
Well, looking back, I would make the following observation. What the Russian president must have expected before he invaded sovereign Ukraine was a conflicted, divided, weak West, disinterested. These were the conclusion he must have drawn from the West's reaction to the war in Georgia, to the annexation of Crimea, to the ongoing war in the Donbass. But what he got was a transatlantic alliance that shows significantly more cohesion than it did before, that was able to shape packages and packages of sanctions, that was able not only to devise, but to follow up on military, political, humanitarian support of Ukraine that is unprecedented. And as far as Germany is concerned, we have seen a sea change in German political, strategic, energy, economic thinking that I wouldn't have thought possible before the 24th of February last year. We are totally off out of Russian fossil fuels now, and we were significantly dependent before. We're now the EU's largest supporter of, military supporter of Ukraine. And mind you, before the war, we even refused to send military equipment to Ukraine. We have received some 1.2 million refugees in Germany from Ukraine. I'm just saying that because Germans and Europeans are affected by the war in ways the US is not. And overall, I often hear the argument that the EU member states and Germany are not doing sufficiently for Ukraine. Well, the observation is in place that the EU and its member state support for Ukraine amounts to 73 billion euro, of which about 25 billion come from Germany.
So you mentioned a few themes that I want to dig into a little bit more. It's military support, obviously, it's energy security, and then just broader conversations that are taking place now about the long-term vision for Ukraine's rebuilding and reconstruction, which is a huge project that's going to require even more unity from the alliance. But on the military side, obviously the biggest development of the last months has been the Leopard tanks. Yes. And that's been seen as a huge shift in German policy in particular, to give the permission not just for Germany to send the Leopard 2s, but to give permission to other countries to send their German-made tanks as well. Of course, there was not necessarily in the public eye always agreement about that. And we saw a lot of debates being played out publicly between Germany, European allies, and the United States that eventually resulted in a deal where the US would commit to sending Abrams tanks and Germany would commit to freeing the leopards, so to say. What took so long?
Some decisions are very complex, and yes, it has taken Germany some time to take decisions that necessarily had to factor in very complex equations, problems, and aspects. And in all things military, decisions don't come easy for Germany. And I don't think I need to explain to you why that is the case. Can I make the following observation? In January this year, a majority of Germans rejected the export of Leopard tanks to Ukraine. After the German Chancellor had taken the decision, a majority has actually been in favor of it. And I think this is the case because a majority in the public feels that the Chancellor takes these decisions after very responsible reflection on all aspects that the decision may imply. It provides legitimacy to positions that could otherwise be very contested. And I would assume that while a majority had not been in favor before, a majority may even have concerns about sending the Leopards, but are in favor because they actually accept the process of decision making. I'd also tell you, Germans are sometimes slow. But if you look where we came from before February 24th, you will see that we have rescinded our strategic thinking in an incredible quick pace. So I think don't look at the individual decisions, which of course you can, but if you look at the entirety and if you look at what actually had changed and what has been appended in our strategic and security thinking, I think that's a lot.
Well, just a quick follow-up there, because you mentioned public opinion, which is of course something that we're discussing very actively in the United States. We've seen the poll numbers about Americans' support for Ukraine, and we have seen a decline. It's been different among Democrats and Republicans. But I think what you said about the change in public opinion once the political decision was made and how profound of an effect that had on Germans, the German population, German citizens thinking on the tank decision in particular.
But hold it. That is the case because the people trusted the processes. And trusted that decisions were taken after a process of reflection that assessed risks, benefits, objectives, and so forth.
And so where would you say the German public is now? And now we are looking at what is likely going to be a long war. And what the Chancellor said, what President Biden have said recently, that we'll be there as long as it takes. On the one hand, that's a very positive statement because it sends the message to Ukrainians that we'll be there as long as it takes. But the other side of that is, I think, also saying that, well, we expect it to take a long time. Is that the expectation, you think, that most people in Germany, not just the political leadership, but the German public, are accepting and realizing that we may be in this for a long time? Yeah. And is that affecting people's commitment to supporting Ukraine in the long term?
Well, let's go point by point. First, there is significant support. There's a majority for the course of the government. I don't see a decline. I think no one can safely say how long the war will take because there's so many variables we don't know as yet. But there is the possibility it may take a longer time, and this doesn't seem to affect a majority's opinion. We are a democracy. We'll always have a lively debate on the pros and cons, on the benefits, downsides, and risks. That's normal. It's actually good. It belongs to, it's an intrinsic part of the legitimacy of the decisions that are being taken. In addition to that, I'd say the following. I think people in Germany, but also in Europe, feel, most of them actually, anyway, that this is not a regional war. It's not a war about territory in Europe. I know this has been recently said by one European. I think it's profoundly wrong. I think it's wrong, and anyone who looks at the degree in which China has espoused the Russian cause, by which I mean the attack on foundational principles of international law, of the international system, of the UN Charter, anyone who sees how China has endorsed it, espoused it, and now tries to exploit a situation that has evolved as a consequence of Russia's aggression, by which I mean the opportunity to proactively change the geopolitical balance of the world, which is visible in the recent mediation of relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran, or the so-called peace plan. It hasn't happened before that China tried to masquerade itself as a peace and power broker for Europe, let alone for the Middle East. That's new. And even if it does not substantially amount to anything, it's a claim, it's a quest. It's a quest for influence in a region where previously China had maintained its role was purely economical. So there's a change. And I would contend that the outcome of the war, by which I mean will it create a permissive environment for attacks on foundational principles, or will it deter from it? The outcome of the war is not only about borders and security in Europe. The outcome of the war is about the future global map of influence, and that's existential for America too. I think people in Europe, most people in Europe realize that. It's a narrative I yet have to see prevailing in America.
Indeed. Well, as you mentioned, wars in Europe feel very far away when you're here in the United States and Washington, but history has shown us that usually wars in Europe eventually touch on the United States in profound ways, because at the end of the day, our own security is dependent on European security, and our ability as the United States to lead the global order, as we have built it together with Europeans, depends on Europe that's whole, free, and in peace.
Okay, that's part of the picture, but it's only part of the picture. I believe that and I've recently said it elsewhere too, that the Russian attack on Ukraine was like an earthquake, where over years, in that case 30 years, tectonic plates had shifted. Early on, 30 years ago, America was the sole superpower in the world, and we saw the beginning of the era of globalization. But in this very time, we also saw that the global GDP shifted significantly, with new actors evolving, and we saw attacks on the international system, the rules that bind us all, and both these trends have come to the fore in the earthquake of the Russian aggression, and now it's really plain and in the open. It is a moment that is the epitome of the end of an era, and China, the single biggest challenge to the United States in the world. And I think that for the first time, the United States is really challenged by a competitor that comes pretty close in terms of resources and means and economic power and technological capabilities. This actor is using the Russian war actively in order to make sure that the future landscape of geopolitics is changed to its favor. So this is not only about Europe. It happens in Europe, but it's about the global influence, clout, normative power, and actually political power of the West.
That was brilliantly said, and I'm tempted to end the conversation here, but if I may, just on China very quickly, because what you brought up is at such an essential point about connecting what is happening in Ukraine that's not a regional war, and not just to the Indo-Pacific, which is the other concern we often hear about in U.S. Policy conversations, but it's really about the shape of the global order as such, right? You know, China's desire to now have a role in Europe has been very interesting.
Yes.
Not just in the economic sense, as you said, but in the political sense. How is that being received in Europe? Because China is an issue that Europeans, broadly speaking, and Americans have not always seen eye to eye on. This has been a wedge in some ways in our relationship for multiple administrations. How is China's desire to be involved in the policy in Europe, to be involved in the politics of Europe, really being perceived from in Berlin, for example?
I think the wedge issue has been overstated in the public conversation here, at least for the last 2 years. But of course, there was a conversation to be had, and there are nuances to it. And look, again, China has endorsed, has espoused the Russian cause. It has espoused the first attack on territorial integrity and the sovereignty of a free nation. It has supported Russia, a country that is committing countless war crimes and atrocities in Ukraine. This is a war with its atrocities that happens at our borders. I do feel that this Chinese course of action will alter Europe's relationship with China.
Last question, I promise, because you mentioned the really incredible reduction in dependency on Russian gas and oil that Germany and Europe have been able to achieve, and that's been quite profound and I think very unexpected that we, especially Germany, were able to do it so quickly, given the dependency that was there before. There is a dependency in some ways on China, though, as well, as an export market for a lot of German businesses and industry, also still as an import market as well. What is the future of that? I mean, I think China is different than Russia. The dependencies are more complex, or the nature of the relationship is more complex. Do you see a future in which there's a realization in Germany in particular that this model is not sustainable? We have such a strong economic relationship with an authoritarian state that seeks to influence not just our economy, but also our politics.
A couple of points here. First is the American relationship, the American dependence on the Chinese market is significantly higher than ours, is growing as the American investment into the Chinese market is. That's just an observation that is to preface what I'm going to say now, which is it has been an orthodoxy in German strategic thinking that interdependence would produce stability, inevitably. That's right. Which has been the case for long, but the Russian aggression against Ukraine has really brought the message home that interdependence produces stability only if both sides agree about the objective of interdependence. If one side exploits dependencies for the vulnerabilities that interdependence can produce for political reasons, then interdependence is actually a threat. And that's the lesson from the Ukrainian war. it adds up to the realization of the COVID-related experience, where we've also seen to what degree supply chains can produce economic vulnerabilities. So I think both lessons now sum up to a very hard thinking in Germany about vulnerabilities, about supply chains, about diversification, about de-risking, about sensitive ecosystems where vulnerabilities are unacceptable, about ultra-advanced technologies and what are ultra-advanced technologies. And we're having this discussion with the American administration, as we should, because this is a vast area where we cannot really afford to move ahead alone, because if we do, we either prevent our partners, for example, in devising supply chains on, say, critical minerals. If we don't move together, one of us will bear the burden of it, and if we don't make sure that de-risking will happen in a way where where one side will not profit from the fact that the other is trying to de-risk. No, that's really a field where we have to work hand in glove in order to protect ourselves and in order to make our approach efficient.
Well, that's perhaps where we should end. I think this conversation could have gone on a lot longer. We didn't touch on some other issues, but we'll save those for another day.
Okay.
It's been such a pleasure, Ambassador Haber. Thank you so much for your leadership.
Thank you.
And for managing what has been the most critical moment for the transatlantic alliance and for the U.S.-German relationship as well since the end of the Cold War, so effectively and efficiently.
Thank you.
It's been great to have you here with us at CEPA. And thank you, everyone, for joining and tuning into this discussion.